All right, so we're diving into this interview with Donald Trump, and, he was on the PBD podcast.
Yeah.
And this deep dive, I think, is going to be particularly interesting for you as an undecided voter.
Absolutely.
Because Trump really lays out his perspective. He doesn't hold back.
He doesn't.
And he comes out swinging, right from the start.
Right from the get-go.
Criticizing Obama's economic record and saying, look, I built this booming economy despite those policies.
It's a very interesting way to frame it, right? It's like almost saying, imagine what I could have done without having to deal with what was left behind.
Right.
It's this idea of untapped potential, right? Like, just think what we could achieve if we
had a clean slate.
Exactly.
And, he brings up quantitative easing, often shortened to QE as like Exhibit A, Look at how weak the economy was under Obama.
Right.
And we actually have a graph here that shows, QE starting in late 2008 and just continuing for years.
Yeah, and this is where, it gets tricky because QE, it's complex. It's not something you can sum up in a soundbite, But essentially, it's the Federal Reserve trying to boost the economy by pumping money into it, usually by buying bonds.
Right. And Trump would say that's just artificial, like propping up a house of cards.
Exactly. He sees it as a Band-Aid solution, not addressing the underlying problems.
And then the graph gets really interesting, I think, when we hit 2016, right? The year Trump takes office, suddenly you see interest rates start to climb.
And that's Trump's philosophy coming into play. He believes in a strong dollar, right? He felt those low interest rates, which were, a hangover from the 2008 crisis, were distorting the market.
Creating this bubble.
Exactly.
And he even calls out Jerome Powell, and remember, that's his appointee, to lead the Federal Reserve, saying Powell was too early and too late with the rate changes. It's like, even with the Fed, which is supposed to be independent,
right,
Trump wants to be hands-on.
Yeah, he's not afraid to challenge the status quo, even when it comes to these institutions, right? Yeah. And that's something you have to think about as a voter. Do you want a president who's that assertive, who's willing to,
To shake things up.
Exactly.
And, we can't talk about Trump without addressing this trend. We're seeing, more and more black male voters seem to be moving towards him. The CNN data really highlights this shift, and it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it's where understanding the nuances of the electorate is so important. Now, Trump, of course, would point to his record on criminal justice reform as a factor here.
Oh, absolutely. And he tells this story about Van Jones, the CNN commentator.
Right.
Practically begging him to pass criminal justice reform. And it's a very compelling story, right? It plays into this idea of Trump as this outsider, this doer, who cuts through the BS and gets things done.
It's a powerful narrative. He positions himself as the one who actually listens to those who've been ignored by the establishment. But, and this is important for any voter to remember, governing is messy, right? What sounds good on paper, or even in a story, doesn't always translate smoothly into policy.
It's never that simple, is it?
Never that simple. It rarely is. And speaking of things that aren't always so simple, let's talk about Trump and the media because,
oh boy,
fake news, that became a catchphrase of his presidency, didn't it?
Absolutely. And you can see it in the data. We're looking at a Gallup poll here, and trust in traditional media, it's plummeted. It's at the lowest level ever recorded.
And that's something you really have to think about as a voter, right? Because a healthy democracy, it depends on informed citizens. And Trump's constantly saying the media is out to get him, calling them corrupt, disgusting, even suggesting what they do could be criminal.
Yeah, he seems particularly bothered by it because he's so quick to remind everyone how he used to get great press, back in his real estate days.
Right.
Like, what happened?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. The media landscape is just completely different now. The internet, social media, the 24-hour news cycle, it's a whole new ballgame. And Trump, whether it's intentional or not, he's really figured out how to use that to his advantage.
He's a master of it.
He is. He can bypass those traditional gatekeepers and speak directly to people, especially through social media.
And we see that same direct approach, I think, when you look at his views on trade and tariffs. He's famous for saying tariffs is the most beautiful word of the dictionary.
More than love.
More than love, even. What do you make of that?
Well, it's certainly a statement, isn't it? It's like he's trying to project strength, this idea that he's not afraid to play hardball to protect American interests.
Yeah, he sees tariffs as a way to bring back jobs, to revitalize American manufacturing. And he loves to tell that story about Tim Cook, Apple's CEO calling him up, worried about the tariffs, right?
Yeah.
How it's going to hurt Apple.
Right.
And Trump's response is classic Trump.
Oh, I bet.
Basically telling him to suck it up and build more in America.
Which, to be fair to Trump, Apple did end up opening that manufacturing plant in Texas.
Right.
But it's not always that straightforward, is it? Tariffs, they can have unintended consequences, higher prices for consumers, businesses that rely on imports taking a hit.
It's a trade-off, and someone always ends up paying the price.
Exactly.
And, sticking with this theme of winners and losers, Trump really plays up his foreign policy record, especially when it comes to Iran. He says, look, the sanctions I imposed, they crippled their economy. They were begging for a deal.
And there's no doubt the sanctions had an impact. We've got a chart right here, and you can see Iran's economic growth just tanking after those sanctions were put in place.
Yeah, he claims they were desperate to make a deal, but then he loses the election, and it all falls apart.
Right, and of course he blames Biden for everything that's happened since. The war in Ukraine, inflation, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's this narrative that under Trump, America was winning, it was safe, and the economy was booming.
Right.
And it's all gone downhill since. Now, whether or not you buy that narrative, that's up to you as a voter.
Right.
But it's a powerful story. He's essentially saying none of these crises would be happening if he were still in charge.
He even goes so far as to say he could have prevented the war in Ukraine.
Which is a bold claim. You can't go back in time, right? You don't know what would have happened. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really makes you think,
Yeah.
What if things had gone differently?
Yeah.
But you know what I find really interesting about this interview is we also get this glimpse behind the curtain, like into Trump's head.
Yeah.
He talks about coming into the White House and feeling like such an outsider.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big part of his story, right? Like, he'd only been to Washington a handful of times, never even spent the night, and suddenly he's the most powerful man in the world.
Trying to navigate this town that's all about, what back rooms you're allowed in.
Exactly. And he's constantly battling this deep state he talks about.
Right. This idea that there were these shadowy figures working against him.
Yeah, it's this idea that there's this whole hidden network within the government pulling the strings. And, it really taps into this distrust of institutions that's so prevalent right now.
And it's not just the deep state. He even suggests, and I found this really interesting, that Kamala Harris might be more dangerous than Biden.
Really?
Yeah, because of, and I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, supposed family ties to Marxism.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
It is, right.
Yeah.
And it gets to this larger pattern with Trump, I think, of painting his opponents as radical, dangerous even.
Right, it's this us versus them mentality.
Exactly. And whether it's intentional or not, it works. It makes people scared. It makes them question everything.
It does. And you have to ask yourself, as a voter, is that the kind of leadership you want? Someone who thrives on division and fear.
It's all about getting people riled up.
Right.
Right. But at the same time, you can't deny he's effective. He's mastered this direct confrontational style. Remember that clip we saw? Him going head-to-head with Chuck Todd about the border wall?
Oh, yeah.
He just stares right into the camera, no filter, and calls him out.
And people respond to that, right? They see it as authenticity.
Right. Especially in this era where everything feels so scripted, so phony.
It's like he's saying what everyone else is thinking, but too afraid to say.
Yeah. But there's a flip side to that too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of rhetoric, it can be so divisive, so toxic.
Absolutely. It makes it almost impossible to have a real conversation, to find common ground. And that's something to consider, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's funny, because despite all the bombast, for lack of a better word, there are these moments in the interview where you see a different side of Trump. He tells this story about his son, Barron, that I thought was really touching.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he talks about how intelligent Barron is, how kind. He even has Barron say hello to the interviewer.
Oh, that's sweet.
And it's just this reminder that, these public figures, these politicians, they're people too. They have families, they have private lives.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that, especially during an election, it's easy to get caught up in the horse race, the polls, the debates. But ultimately, we're choosing a person to lead us.
Right.
Not just a set of policies.
And that's the challenge for you, right? As an undecided voter, trying to figure out who that person really is, beyond the sound bites, beyond the slogans. And hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about.
I think so, too.
It's your vote, it's your future, so make it count.